Today, we will discuss the unifying principle of biology, which is the cell theory. At the end of the lesson, you are expected to define what is spontaneous generation, discover the proponents behind the development of the cell theory, create a timeline that led to the postulate of cell theory, and demonstrate understanding of the cell theory as one of the bases of biology. Long time ago, people have questioned the origin of life. Different aspects like religion, philosophy, and science have a different interpretation of where does the life come from. But how did life start? Well, if you ask me if I am trying to pose an argument of ignorance here, well, that is not my intention. Because if you believe on the theory of special creation, I respect that. If you believe that life started like how Professor Utonium mixed sugar, spice, and everything nice, and that we have Powerpuff Girls, then that's another story of growing up. There are several theories on the origin of life. We have the theory of special creation, stating that life was created by supernatural power like God or the gods and goddesses of mythologies in the form which has not undergone any change. Well, that explains why we have Adam and Eve in the Christian faith or the Vedas of Hinduism. Another theory is the theory of chemical evolution, which is also known as materialistic. In this theory, the origin of life on Earth is the result of a slow and gradual process of chemical evolution, which probably started about 3.5 billion years ago when the Earth is still young. Some proponents of this theory are Oparin and Haldane. We also have Miller and Urey, who conducted several experiments to prove on this theory of the origin of life. Cosmozoic theory or panspermia is a theory that life reached Earth from other heavenly bodies such as meteorites. Biogenesis, on the other hand, is a theory that life only comes from life, thanks to Louis Pasteur. Well, we're going to discuss more about Louis Pasteur later on. Lastly, we have spontaneous generation, which we'll discuss further in order to arrive to the postulate of the cell theory. The theory of spontaneous generation is one of the oldest theories on the origin of life, which can be traced back during the Greek periods until the Middle Ages. It simply states that life may arise spontaneously from non-living matter or inanimate matter. But do you know that this theory was already debunked? Well, the reason why, well, we're gonna know more about this spontaneous generation, why it was already not considered or as true. Because how in this world a cheese can produce a mouse? That's kind of weird, right? The early Greek thinker Aristotle was one of the first to articulate the theory of spontaneous generation, that according to him, life arose from non-living material if the material contained pneuma or vital heat. As evidence, he noted several instances of the appearance of animals from environments previously devoid of such animals, such as the seemingly sudden appearance of fish in a new puddle of water. This theory had persisted until the 17th century when scientists conducted additional experiments to support or disprove it. Some believers of this theory even cited how frogs appear along the muddy banks of the Nile River in Egypt during annual floodings. Others claim that a mice or flea may spontaneously generated by barley or dust, some stuff like that. John Baptist von Helmont, a 17th century Flemish scientist, supported the theory of spontaneous generation by declaring a unique experiment, but no experimental evidence was provided. He claimed that barley grains and soiled shirt, which were left at the corner, would give rise to mice after 3 weeks of fermentation. The truth is, such habitats provided ideal food and shelter for mouse population to flourish. First to disprove the theory of spontaneous generation is a contemporary of John Baptist von Helmont. He was none other than Francesco Redi. He predicted that preventing flies from having direct contact with the meat would also prevent the appearance of maggots, therefore conducting an experiment in 1668 to make his own conclusion on the widely debated theory of spontaneous generation. In his experiment, Redi left meat in each different containers. A container that was open to the air, another container covered with gauze, and a container that was tightly sealed. His hypotheses were supported by when maggots developed in the uncovered jar, but no maggots appeared in either the gauze-covered or tightly sealed jars, thus making a conclusion that maggots could only form when flies were allowed to lay eggs in the meat, and that the maggots were the offsprings of these flies, not just a product of spontaneous generation. In 1745, John Needham conducted an experiment to refute Reddy's disapproval of spontaneous generation, claiming that a life force like air and oxygen must be present in an organic matter to generate life. Needham conducted his grave experiment where he briefly boiled the broth infused with plant or animal matter, hoping to kill all pre-existing microbes. He then sealed the flask, but some say he did not actually cover the flask. After a few days, he observed that the broth had become cloudy and a single drop contained numerous microscopic organisms. What do you think is wrong with Needham's experiment? Well, I think he just briefly boiled the broth, which is not enough to kill all pre-existing molecules or microbes, or did not cover the flask immediately as well. He lacks a controlled group to prove his experiment as acceptable and true. Lazzaro Spallanzani was an Italian Catholic priest, biologist, and physiologist who made important contributions to the experimental study of bodily functions, animal reproduction, and animal echolocation. He contradicted Needham's experiment, who redesigned the latter scientist's experiment. So what he did, this time, he thoroughly boiled the broth in both jars. The other jar was left open and the other was sealed. As a result of his experiment, the sealed jar has no microorganisms, unlike the open jar, who developed microorganisms. However, his critics said that with an extended time boiling, he killed the life force that was required for spontaneous generation. The debate on spontaneous generation continued until the 19th century, and to settle the debate, the Paris Academy of Sciences offered a prize for resolution of the problem. Our next genius came to the rescue, who ended the debate on the theory on spontaneous generation, and he was none other than a French guy by the name of Louis Pasteur. He was a biologist and chemist renowned for his discoveries of the principles of vaccination. The vaccination of anthrax. Anthrax was discovered by Robert Koch, just for you to know, and rabies vaccination for rabies. Louis Pasteur is also known for the fermentation process as well as pasteurization. Though he is not the first to introduce the germ theory of disease, he is remembered for his remarkable breakthroughs in the causes and prevention of diseases. Pasteur's one-neck experiment consisted of two parts. In the first part, the broth in the flask was boiled to sterilize it. When this broth was cooled, it remained free of contamination. In the second part of the experiment, the flask was boiled and then the neck was broken off. The broth in these flasks became contaminated. So in 1864, Louis Pasteur finally announced the results of his scientific experiments. Pasteur's empirical results were summarized in the phrase omne vivum ex vivo. It is a Latin word which means all life is from life. Therefore, our final conclusion, if spontaneous generation is true, then the flask neck would have developed bacteria spontaneously, but it did not happen, which indicates germs would come from other germs. Pasteur's experiment became a benchmark in microbiology and led to the germ theory of disease. Many equate abiogenesis with the archaic theory of spontaneous generation. But are they really the same? Well, How about no? Because the two ideas are different, since abiogenesis is the idea that life arose from non life during the primordial earth, while spontaneous generation means that a complex life like maggots, mice, etc., were thought to arise spontaneously from non living matter. Okay, so spontaneous generation greatly contributed to the more accepted theory, and that is a theory of a cell. With the invention of the first compound optical microscope in the 1590s by a Dutch father-son tandem named Hans and Zacharias Janssen, many ambitious scientists at the time came to use, if not improve, this invention. One of them was the first man to discover cell and gave us the name cell. But who discovered cells? Well, thanks to these monks. Not really, but yeah, rather thanks to this man's ambitious curiosity on little critters. Robert Hooke was credited for his discovery of the cell in 1665, wherein he improved the design of the existing compound microscope at the time to look at thin slices of cork, and he saw row upon row of tiny square chambers. He detailed his observation in his book Micrographia, and he coined his discovery as cells, which he reminded him of the rooms where the monks lived in a monastery. Well, I get the reason why we have all those monks on this slide. After almost a decade of the discovery of cells, a Dutch scientist, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, also crafted his own powerful lenses and perfected the simple microscope. He then detected minuscule organisms, which were protozoa, that was discovered in 1674, and bacteria, which was discovered in 1675. So, just a year after the discovery of protozoa, that the bacteria was discovered, and he called these tiny creatures as animalcules. Other notable observations of Leeuwenhoek include spermatozoa, that was in 1677, and was able to extend Marcello Malfighi's demonstration of the blood capillaries by giving the first accurate description of the red blood cells. And he proved as well that flea are not spontaneously generated from dust, but rather it bred in the regular way of winged insects. Also, he was the first to show that what had been commonly refuted to be ants' eggs were really their pupa, containing the perfect insect nearly ready for emergence, and that the true eggs were much smaller and gave origin to maggots or larvae. He also argued that the sea mussel and other shellfish were not generated out of sand found at the seashore or mud in the beds of rivers at low water, but from spawn by this regular course of generation, same as with freshwater mussel. Leeuwenhoek's observation helped lay the foundation for the sciences of bacteriology and protozoology. In 1883, a botanist named Robert Brown, with the aid of a light microscope, discovered a sphere-like structure inside a plant, and he called it as a nucleus. However, scientists could readily tell the plants are made up of cells due to their cell wall, which was not so obvious for animal cell, because animal cell lack cell wall. Therefore, they believed that animals were made of globules. Cell theory is a fundamental aspect of modern biology. This powerful generalization has played an essential role in explaining the basic unity of plant and animal life. The mechanisms of inheritance, fertilization, development and differentiation, and evolutionary theory. Building upon the discovery of the cell nucleus by Robert Brown, Matthias Jakob Schleiden demonstrated that plants are composed of cells and cell products. Then a German zoologist, physician, and physiologist named Theodor Schwann claimed that all animals are made up of cells. Both working independently at the time, they came up to a conclusion that living things are indeed made up of cells. Thus, in 1839, they came up with their conclusion about cells, which states that the cell is a unit of structure, physiology, and organization in living things. The cell retains a dual existence as a distinct entity and a building block in the construction of organisms, and cells form by free cell formation, similar to the theory of spontaneous generation. In 1858, after exhaustive studies into cell reproduction, Rudolf Virchow, a German physician and pathologist, finally interpreted that cells formed by division. He is famous for his powerful dictum, omnis cellula e cellula, that it means all cells only arise from pre-existing cells. So, the modern cell theory states that all known living things are made up of cells. Second, the cell is a basic structural and functional unit of all living things. And lastly, all cells come from pre-existing cells. In order for you to memorize this one, just remember ABC. A, all living things are made up of cells. B, basic, structural, and functional unit of all living things. And C, cell comes from pre-existing cells. And we also have that expanded version. Cells carry genetic material passed to daughter cells during cellular division. All cells are essentially the same in chemical composition. And lastly, energy flow occurs within cells. Okay, so yeah, you can just sum it up what you have learned today, and you just have to accomplish all the activities written in your learning activity sheets. So, and for your assignment, I want you to review the different structures and functions of the cell, and I want you to answer these 20-item posters. So, yeah, that's it. And I hope that you have learned a lot today. And please prepare for our next lesson about cells. Thank you for listening.